All right, so we will go ahead and we will move on to this week's lesson, okay? So just kind of starting out in that first little paragraph there, after Jesus talked to his disciples about persecution, so you remember that what we looked at last week was when Jesus, first of all, said all of those blessings, and then he said, blessed are you when men persecute you. And so after talking about that, now he's going to go on to talk about this next section. And it could be that, some of the people there, after hearing about blessed are you when you're persecuted, there may be some people that just kind of, recoil back from that a little bit. Because I think that that's kind of a natural reaction. That's kind of a reaction that I might have. And there may be some people who might be thinking, okay, well, if being a disciple for Jesus is going to be leading to persecution, is there a way that I can be a disciple of Jesus, but at the same time kind of balance that out to where, I stay on the good side of the world? Have you ever met people like that? They just want to stay on everybody's good side, and so they'll do something over here to try to stay on their good side, do something over there to try to stay on their good side. And, hopefully it's all going to work out. Are we being serenaded? Just a little bit. So, it's kind of like just, wondering, is there a way that I can be with the world and at the same time be with Christ? And you really can't. What we're going to be looking at tonight is to really kind of see the purpose that Jesus had for his disciples and for us as well. And we're going to be seeing that Jesus is going to be comparing his disciples to two different illustrations, and that is the illustration of salt and the illustration of light. So, taking a look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by people. So, that first illustration with salt, what do we use salt for?
Melting snow.
What?
Melting snow.
Oh, melting snow. I thought you said melting snuff, and I was like, what? I've never heard that. Okay, yeah, melting snow. But for all the other times,
salty things.
Flavoring, money.
Flavoring.
It's used for curing.
Yeah.
What is it, favor?
Favor.
Flavor.
What is it, favor?
Tavoring. Oh.
It's just getting worse. Wow.
Flavoring, curing. Okay. Huh? Well, curing, that's, we as far as our normal use, this is pretty much it, Okay, making ice cream, yeah. That actually kind of goes along with melting snow, though. But attracting deer, yeah. Okay. All right, so there's a lot more uses of salt in our day and age than what I gave it credit for. Mainly, though, we use salt for flavoring, right? What they used salt for more than anything else was curing meat, preserving meat. And the way that it worked was, and I guess the way it works now, is that, they'd have meat because they don't have refrigeration, and so they would take a piece of meat and then they would take salt and they would rub on it and get it coated in salt. And they'd let it just sit there and kind of dry out. And then they'd brush that salt and then they'd put more salt on. And then they'd brush that off and then come back and put more salt on it until it's just kind of cured to jerky. Never done that before. Anybody made jerky?
Yes, but not by curing it with salt.
Okay. But fish too, yeah. Yeah, so that's the way that they preserve things. And so that was the most common use of salt back in that day. And it was actually a very valuable commodity because, if you think about it, since you don't have ways of preserving meat other than using salt, it's going to be pretty valuable. As a matter of fact, our word salary, do you know where we get our word salary? It went back to the day and age in which Roman soldiers were paid in salt. That they were paid in salt, and that was the expression. That's where we get the expression. A man is worth his salt, means that he's worth what you're paying him for. So, kind of interesting. And so that's what the first illustration that Jesus gives about his disciples. Okay. So then the next illustration in verse 14 through 16 is about light. And that is, he says, you are a light of the world, or you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. And so we've got two different things, illustrations of light here. One is a city that's set up on a hill isn't going to be hidden because it is lit up. And so if you think about being in a semi-arid environment where you're not going to have as many trees and bushes what we have here in Missouri, but you're going to have kind of a low, not very much vegetation. So a city that's going to be up on a hill, and most cities you wanted to be up on a hill because that was a very defensible place. And so, villages and such, not so much. But if you're going to have a city, especially with walls, they would want that up on a hill because that gave a little bit more protection. So you've got a city that's going to be up on a hill, and you've got the torches that are going to be in the city. You've got maybe people's lamps that are going to be the houses, and so on and so forth. So it's not a city like what we've got today as far as the lighting goes, but it's going to be enough. And so, if you are there and you don't have street lights and stuff, so you're when you're at night out back then, it's going to be dark. And so you're going to be able to look a long way off. And if you've got a city that's up on a hill, that even though it's not, very well lit as compared to what we think of today, it is still going to be very visible and very noticeable. Okay, and so that's why Jesus said, a city on a hill cannot be hidden. And then he goes on to talk about this, people lighting a lamp and do not put it under a basket, but on the lampstand. And so the way that they had lighting back then was they would have, a very shallow bowl. I'm doing my best to draw a very shallow bowl. Okay. And then they would put the wick right there, and then they'd put olive oil in the bowl, and then when you lit it, you'd have your little flame right there on the end, okay? Now, that's not going to put out a whole lot of light, is it? But that's what you've got. And so if you had that, their houses, would have been maybe a one-room house. It wouldn't have been that big of a room. And so there would have been some kind of ledge that would have been up high. The reason would have been up high is because you'd light it and then you put it on that ledge. And then, have you ever been, camping and you had like a little bitty flashlight or something, and you hung it from the top of the tent so that it would light everything? You had it down low, it's not going to produce that much light, but you put it up on top, it scatters it out. And so that's what he's saying is that when you have this lamp, you're going to light it, you're going to put it up on the ledge so that, it can give light to everyone in the house, okay? And so, those are kind of different illustrations, and wanted to talk a little bit about that before we got into things so that we could kind of understand a little bit about the culture and the customs of the day, okay? All right, let's take a look at some of these questions then. Looking at the illustration of salt in verse 13, did Jesus tell the disciples they needed to be salt?
Pretty much implied. He says you are, not you will be.
Yes, you are the salt of the earth, okay? And so it's not, you will be, you might be, you could be, you should be. It's none of those things. It's you are the salt of the earth. So what does that tell us about, our discipleship with the Lord? When he says you are the salt of the earth. It's a state of being, right? So when you think about our discipleship and the relationship of what that means to the Lord, it's there, it's present. It's not that we need to become salt. It's not that we are going to get better and better in our discipleship to be salt at a future day and time. It's not that we should be salt. It's not that if we do certain things, we could be salt. The point is that we are salt, okay? So when you think about disciples and Jesus' disciples, are all disciples the same? No. There's going to be some people that may be further along in their discipleship than others, right? There's going to be some people that are dragging their heels, so to speak, and there's going to be some people that are just on fire completely for the Lord, right? There's going to be some people that just are constantly messing up and making mistakes, and there's going to be some people that are going to be very disciplined. But the point is this, that if we are Jesus' disciples, we therefore are salt, period. It's not that we could be salt or should be salt or will be salt or might be salt. It's that we are salt. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Question number 2. How can salt lose its saltiness? Because Jesus says here, if the salt has become tasteless or if it has lost its saltiness, how is it going to be made salty again? So let's ask the question, how can salt lose its taste? Just think about regular salt. How can it lose its taste? Does it? Diluted? Okay. All right.
Or mixed up with something. Mixed up.
Okay, contaminated?
Yeah, contaminated.
Okay. Because if you think about it, salt, and I'm going way back to my high school chemistry days, NaCl, sodium chloride, right? Okay. And so if you've got sodium chloride, this is a, Paul, you can help me out. It's a compound, right?
Yeah, it's a crystal.
Yeah, so it unless you exert chemical means to it, you're not going to break the sodium and the chloride.
Right.
It's going to be stuck together, right? And so therefore, it's not going to decay. It's not going to, go bad, so to speak. You could have salt from 1,000 years ago, and it's salt, right? It's different than cheese. You can let cheese sit for 1,000 years, and somebody's going to say it's great. Somebody's going to say it's gross, but
Cheese is not a compound.
huh?
You're saying cheese is not.
I think cheese is not a compound. I don't know. What is cheese a compound?
Everything's a compound.
Okay, everything's a compound. All right, then compound's not the word that I'm thinking of. There are a mixture of molecules, but then there are atoms come together and their molecular bond creates something. And I can't remember what that word is if it's not compound.
Paul should know.
Huh?
It's a compound.
It's compound, okay. All right.
Come on, Paul, speak up.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that there is a molecular, an atomic attraction between NaCl. And so when you make it, you have to exert chemical means to dissolve it and break it back into sodium and chloride. Anything else is just going to decay. But salt is not going to decay because salt is a pure substance. Right?
We'll talk about the chemistry later.
Okay. Well, we got a chemist over here, so I'm bag me up, Paul.
Microbiologist.
Well, yeah, but Paul, did you study chemistry to be a microbiologist?
Yeah.
Okay. There we go.
Quite a bit, I think.
Quite a bit.
Yes.
Okay.
You forgot everything.
Well, I did too. So, okay. And you had a lot more to forget than I did. So, all right. So, thinking about that regard, what we're saying as far as how does salt lose its saltiness? Well, it's diluted or it's contaminated. How does a disciple lose their effectiveness? Because what we're talking about as far as salt goes, as far as curing or preserving, that's what Jesus is saying for the disciples. What the disciples are to the world is what salt is to those people. It's going to be the preserving element. It's going to be the curing element. Okay? So, how can a disciple lose their effectiveness to where they're not going to be that salt of the earth anymore?
Not walking the talk.
Not walking the talk.
Destroying your witness.
Destroying your witness.
Bad behavior.
Bad behavior. We're talking about the same thing, right? Yeah.
I'm maybe slightly missing the analogy here, but if salt is left alone, it's not going to cure anything.
Well, that
Maybe
is.
if we isolate ourselves as disciples,
Mm-hmm.
then we lose some of our saltiness.
Well, I mean, that is taking this in a different regard because that's not what he's saying, even though what you're saying is true. We do need to be out in the world.
Yeah.
But what he's saying in the question here is of what Jesus said, where is my... And that is, if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? So what we're saying is, how can it become tasteless or lose its saltiness? By being polluted, right? Contaminated, diluted, okay? And so the question that Jesus says here is this, and that is, how can it be made salty again? So if you've got salt that is contaminated, how are you going to make the salt good? You're not going to bother, are you? Right? Put yourself back in those days sometimes. You go to the store, you buy a batch of salt, right? You don't know it, but there's a lot of contaminants in that salt. And the reason why the contaminants are there is because the salt's not pure. Instead of just being salt, it's salt and dirt because, the main way that they got salt back in those days and times was they went out and they dug it up out of the ground. And so, you've got this batch of salt, but you don't realize that it's got a lot of dirt in it as well, contaminants. So you go home, you got your fish that you just caught out of the Sea of Galilee. You put it on there, day 1, Day 2, you come back and you put some more on there. Day 3, you come back and you notice that your fish just is a little bit too fishy, okay? So what are you going to do? You're going to say, this salt that I'm using is bad. Are you going to go back to this market and are you going to buy more salt and then dump it in the batch of bad salt? No, because that's not going to do anything, right? You're going to take what you've got and what are you going to do with it? Okay? So that's what he says. It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Okay? What? Melt? Yeah, you can use it to melt snow. That's right. Okay. Actually, what they would do is they'd take their, their used salt and stuff, and they would go in, they would throw it out on the sidewalk, and they would make sidewalks and stuff out of it, So. Okay, I think we are actually moving into question number 3 with that. Question number 3, how does a person whose testimony has lost its effectiveness compare to salt that has lost its saltiness? Okay? Well, we've already talked about that, right? It's not going to be effective. So what can be done with it? It's got to be pitched, right? Okay. When you think about us and what we do with the world, worldliness is never going to help our godliness. Worldliness is never going to affect our testimony for the world. We may think it would, but it really doesn't. What we need to do is we need to concentrate on being pure. Because what happens is if we, and we're all going to have some kind of worldliness within us, right? Because we're sinners. But when it reaches a point where we're no longer going to be effective, then there's not really anything that can be done for that because we've lost our witness, you know? We can be out, we could be with the world, we could be doing all kinds of the things that the world does, and, you know, the world could be looking at us and saying, well, you know what? That Steve there, he says he's a Christian, but he's just like us, so, you know, I don't really see the difference between a Christian and what a non-Christian is. You know, once I get to that point and I've developed that reputation, what can be done with my testimony? Just not a whole heck of a lot. Now, moving back to our question here, does this mean that the disciple cannot ever be used by God? No. What does the disciple need to do? Right, needs and get rid of the contaminants, right? You know, and then you are a fresh batch of salt. Right. And it could be that, no, you know, the fish that we used the salt on, you know, fish is gone. But that doesn't mean that we can't be used on another piece of fish. Okay? Does that make sense? More or less? Okay. All right. Moving onward to that example of light. What do you think of when you think of light? When Jesus says you are the light of the world, what was Jesus referring to? So we've talked about salt, but what about light? What is light metaphorically? Yeah?
Being visible.
Okay, something that's going to enlighten.
Yeah, I think about knowledge, purity. And truth.
Okay. Something that is like purity is holiness.
And obedience.
Okay.
Absence of darkness.
Okay. Well, that's kind of, you know, holiness, purity. How about that? Okay. Love. If you can read my writing. Is that better? Okay. So when we talk about light, we kind of understand what light is. When we just, you know, anything that we could associate with light, we can associate with this. And, you know, light is going to be, actually darkness is going to be the absence of light. And so, here's another one. Goodness. All right. So anything that is going to be absent of light is going to be darkness. And so you think about anything that's absent of goodness, absent of love, absence of obedience, absent of truth, absent of holiness, absent of knowledge, or enlightenment, then that is what would be describing sin, wouldn't it? Okay, because it's an absence of light, right? Okay. Everybody got that? Okay. So, how do you think that this relates to Jesus and the disciples when he says, you're the light of the world? Right. And they're the salt of the earth, right? And so, by being the light of the world, they're also going to be the salt of the earth. Right? Because they're the ones that's going to be showing the world all of these traits, which are traits of God. Okay? And by doing that, that's how they can be the salt of the earth and the light of the world.
They show God.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus.
They do.
Because Jesus was not, he went to heaven and they're still on the prison.
Mm-hmm. And Jesus said, I am the light of the world. And so by Jesus' disciples following him, then they are going to be showing themselves to be the light of the world too. You know, if Jesus is the light of the world and then they go and follow something else, then they're not showing Jesus' traits. Jesus being the light of the world, they follow Jesus, then they're showing Jesus' traits, and so therefore they're the light of the world too. Okay? All right. Back to the question, and that is, what two uses of light are given in verses 14 and 15? Okay? So looking at verses 14 and 15 here, what two uses do we see of light?
Light of a lamp.
Okay, so we've got the lamp. Oops. Okay, and then the city. All right. So just kind of think about these two things. What does, the city and what Jesus is talking about with the city, and what does the lamp and what Jesus is talking about the lamp, what is it that these two things have in common? Why would Jesus say these things back to back?
See them in the dark.
Okay. And so, a city set on a hill cannot be hidden. So when you think about Jesus' comparison to the disciples, what do you think he was trying to say with a city that's on a hill cannot be hidden? What do you think he's trying to say about the disciples?
People are going to look at them and how they live,
Okay.
what they say,
And it's not going to be hidden, is it?
right? How they act. Yeah.
Okay. Do you think that there are times that people will try to hide their Christianity, maybe because of what Jesus just talked about, maybe because of fear of persecution, or just fear of what other people are going to say?
Try that Pakistan, see what happens.
Yeah? Okay. Well, let's just try it here. I don't want to go to Pakistan. Trying it here, have there ever been a time that you just kind of felt like, I don't want to mix it up with the world. I want to try to, kind of blend in and hide a little bit. How well did it work?
No, it can work for a little bit, but then you can't hide.
Well, I mean, people will always notice a difference, won't they? There was time back, when I was in high school that I felt like, I can just, be my own person and do my own thing and, go to church on Sunday, go to church on Wednesday, but the rest of the time it's going to be for me. And, I never did fit in. And I always wondered, why don't I fit in? And, now I know why I never fit in. And the way it is now, there's times that I'll go and I'll be around people, and I just don't fit in. And I'm a square peg in a round hole, so to speak, And it's this right here. When you are a disciple of Jesus, you have a new nature. And when you have a new nature, that new nature is going to show. You can try to hide it, but it won't work. I mean, it's going to come through some way, some form, some fashion, because we are the light of the world, right? Okay. What about that next one about lighting the lamp and putting it under a basket? Do people do that?
No.
No, they put it up on the lampstand, right? Okay. Why do people put it on the lampstand instead of under a basket? Let it shine. Okay. So what does that talk about as far as the disciples being the light of the world? What can we say as far as the point of comparison that Jesus is saying with that?
Their job to illuminate the darkness and the evil and the nastiness.
Okay, and we do that, by the way, by just simply being us. You know, it's not like we have to go out and go, that's evil. I'm shining the light on that. You know, it's just... But if you think about it, when somebody tries to hide their testimony, what is really happening is, first of all, they're not going to do it, but the second thing that's happening is that they are really defeating their purpose in life, right? You know, when you stop and think about it, when God saved us, there is a reason why He saved us. I mean, there's a motive why He saved us. The motive of Him saving us is because He loves us. And there's an objective of why He saved us, and the objective is that He's going to take us to heaven. But the purpose of us being here is, you know, to be that source of light. Okay? All right. Going on down to the next question. When speaking about light, we have two sources for it, illuminators and reflectors. Do you guys understand the difference between an illuminator and a reflector? Okay. The projector is illuminator. The screen is a reflector. Okay? When you look at this, where's the real source of light? Right there, right? Okay. But you don't see that. What you do is you see this. Okay? Because what is happening is that the light is going from the projector, hitting the screen, bouncing off the screen, and then impacting your eyeballs. And so, you know, and then our brain processes the light into an image. Paul, did I get that right? Paul, I'm glad you're here tonight. You can back me up, right? Okay.
Didn't tell me I'm rather slow.
I don't know if that's the right idea. Okay. Okay. So in verse number 16, what two light sources, or what of these two different light sources would the disciples be? So in verse number 16, he says, your light must shine before men or people in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Who are we? Are we reflectors or are we illuminators? We're reflectors. Okay, what about God? He's the illuminator, right? Okay, so now we come back to this idea about, you know, this light that is shining within us. And, you know, Chloe, you mentioned about, or you didn't mention it, but I mean, you know, talking about, ooh, that's darkness. You know, ooh, that's darkness. The way it really works is that God is the source, the illuminator, and when He works in us, then that is reflected towards people, right? And so as we are following the Lord, and as we are being His disciples, then the Lord and His Spirit is showing us what's right and wrong, good and bad. The Lord is empowering us to do those things. The Lord is giving us the fruit of the Spirit and working in our lives. And so slowly but surely, what's happening is our lives are being shown to people, and that light is being reflected off of it, okay? And so now do you see why it's so important to not have those contaminants in there? Because when you got those contaminants, then what happens to the light? Even though we're mixing the two different metaphors, it starts to go down, right? Okay. Going back to our sheet, next question is, What is God's purpose in disciples allowing His light to shine in their lives? Why does God do this?
For other people.
To show his love.
That is true, but we don't have to look outside of the verse. We can look right at the verse and see it in verse number 16.
So that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father who's in heaven.
There you go. Glorify your Father in heaven. That is why God is doing it. Okay? It's so that people can glorify God. Now, what does this really mean? Does this mean that when people are looking at us, then they see our good works and they go, oh, praise be to God. Now, that can happen, right? Especially when we talk about, some of the things here of like love and goodness. There can be times that people will see God's love, God's goodness coming through in your life, and they will recognize that you are being a good person, because of your walk with the Lord, because of your discipleship. And so they might even say something like, you know what, I wish I had a close walk with God like you do. Okay? They may tell you that, or they may, recognize it in their heart. Do you think that that is glorifying God? I think it is, because they are noticing something that God is doing and they're recognizing that it is a good thing, Now, whether or not they're going to actually put it into practice or not in their lives, the very fact that they're looking at it as far as coming from God and being a good thing is giving God the glory. Now, the ultimate glory would be that they would look at it and they would say, you know what, I need that in my life too. And so they would start to follow the Lord and they would start to be a disciple. But even if they don't, the very fact that they're recognizing as a good thing, that's glorifying God. What happens is somebody looks at these traits, though, and says, I don't like it. Instead, I'm going to persecute somebody who's doing these things. How can God be glorified in that regard?
Because Jesus was suffering too.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I will and you will be too. So God glorifying for us is still strong in this humane situation.
So what you're saying is that Jesus' life was for the glory of God, whether or not people recognized it or agreed with it or even appreciated it, right? So what you're saying is that Jesus, in his obedience to God, was something that would glorify God even if it meant his death. Right? Okay. So, if we are following the Lord, and just because we have people that are against us and opposed to us, we may not feel like we're doing a lot of good, but the very fact that we are following God, sometimes it's that idea of it takes light in order to expose darkness. And that is something that's going to glorify God as far as to expose the darkness so the light can be magnified. Chris?
Just a thought. And how do we react when we're persecuted?
Well, actually,
Would that be a way it brings glory to God?
yes. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. If we're going to react in light, it's going to bring glory to God. Because if we're going to react in love and allowing the Lord to work through us, then absolutely. And some of the, just kind of looking down through history, sometimes God's glory is really the most amplified in the darkness of places. I remember reading a story or hearing a story about, Christianity was starting to work its way into the ranks of the Roman army. And, it was discovered that there were Christians. And so I guess there was a couple of men that were suspected. And so the centurion had them stripped down to their, take all the clothes off, go out in the middle of a frozen lake, and said, we're going to be out there, you're going to be out there until all of you renounce Christ. And so, of course, the ones that weren't Christians, they're going to renounce Christ and they're going to leave really quickly, but the ones that were Christians, they would not renounce Christ. And so they would just stand out there in the lake. And so the centurion said, see, I'm making an example of these two so that nobody will follow them. And one man said, no, you're going to make an example out of three. And he stripped off his armor and he went out to be with the other two to die. And so it's the idea that even in extreme situations, God still can get the glory from all of that. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. All right, back to our sheet. Let's take a look at Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. All right, so Philippians chapter 2, verse number 14 says, do everything without complaining or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a crooked and deprived generation, in which you shine like stars in the universe as you hold out the word of life, in order that I may boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor for nothing. Okay? So, how do those verses match what we're talking about here?
Become pure, blameless and pure.
Okay.
And that's what we were talking about with the salt.
Right. And by the way, how can we become blameless and pure? Yeah, like that. Well, without complaining or arguing. Okay? Which, when you stop and think about it, when we look about being salt and being pure and everything, we think, oh yeah, okay, that means that, I'm no to pornography, no to alcohol, no to, adultery, no to, all of that stuff. But what does this say? This is something that's real easy, right? Just don't argue, just don't complain. Okay? How hard is that to really put into action?
How is your day at your work?
Oh, you're getting a trigger there, right? But I mean, if you stop and think, have you run into people that don't argue and they don't complain? And you don't even really know them, but some of the people that don't argue and don't complain, what's going through your mind is they must be a Christian. And they may not even be one, but I mean, it's, that is the effect that's being out there. And so just doing that, we're going to shine like stars. Okay? Now, a single star observed by us here on Earth, how much light is that? Not much, right? When we go out in the daytime, the stars are shining.
I was gonna say, unless it's the sun. which
Okay,
is
okay,
star
yeah.
observed by us on Earth.
I get it. Okay, I get it. But I mean, you think about it, the reason why the stars stand out is because of the darkness of the night. And so if we're just going to be like what God wants us to be, it's going to stand out in the darkness of the world. Right? Okay. Let's take a look at the last question. What beatitude from last week matches what we're talking about tonight? So last week, come on now. There we go. Beatitude from last week. What do you think matches? Okay. Pure in heart. That's a possibility. Right? Is there something else? Meek. Okay, blessed are the gentle. Okay.
Merciful.
People who are, okay. All right.
Poor in spirit.
Poor in spirit? Okay. Peacemakers? Okay.
All of them.
Well,
Persecuted, yeah, because of righteousness.
persecuted? Okay. All right. I was actually, when I wrote this out, I was really just thinking about this right here, pure in heart. But, as you guys are saying this, I'm thinking, well, yeah, a case can be made for it. So what are the cases that you're making for this? Put you on the spot here. What?
Which I revoke mine.
Okay.
So I can't make a case. I thought I could, but I can't.
Oh, okay. All right.
But I was thinking something else.
Okay, we're going to take that off then. Somebody else had one.
Like a peacemakers, like, not arguing, not complaining.
Yeah, okay. That's good.
Well, I was thinking like
Before we get off that, they'll be called sons of God, and so there's that light, right? It's being shined. Okay. Chris?
I was thinking blessed are those who have been persecuted.
Mm-hmm.
Because we've kind of been dancing around this topic of, at least on my side, we've kind of been talking a little bit about persecution, Like if you're persecuted, you're going to let your light shine through that. Or if you're salt, or if people are going to know, even if they're coming against you, that you're the salt of the earth.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can see that. Absolutely. Okay. Moving on to the second page, just taking it further. Is it possible to serve God but keep our relationship with the world? Nope. Just as sin and righteousness don't mix, worldliness and godliness will not go together. Have there been times that people have disliked you because you were a Christian?
Yes.
Yep. Yep. When it happened, what did you do?
Ignored it.
Kept going?
I'll be honest, when I've had it happen to me, it hurt me.
Hurt you?
Maybe not as much now, but when I was younger, it bothered me.
Yeah.
A couple times I've tried to fix the situation.
Okay.
But that's kind of me. If somebody doesn't like me, I'm going to be like, well, why don't they like me? What can I do to make them like me?
Uh-huh.
How can I fix it?
Just in curiosity, did it make the situation worse?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes it does that. After you've looked at these verses, what can we do about this in the future? If somebody's against us, persecuting us, one thing that we need to understand is that we don't need to try to egg it on, obviously, right? But at the same time, we don't need to try to help the situation. Because the situation, what's got us into that situation to begin with, is a good thing. And so what we need to do is we just need to continue to do what we're doing and let God work it all out, because maybe God has a plan and God has a purpose in it. Right? Okay, you got any questions or anything about this lesson tonight?